Today's guest on A Life and a Living podcast is Scott Young, who's a very interesting young man. He's a writer. He undertakes interesting self-learning projects. For example, doing the 4-year MIT computer course in 1 year, which is quite an achievement. He also learned 4 languages in 1 year, which is also an extraordinary achievement. He lives in Vancouver. He has published a fascinating book called Ultralearning, and we talk a bit about that in the interview. But some of the issues that we cover in the interview is why traditional learning methods are out of date, and what Scott believes is the new way and a more effective way of learning. We also talk about how you retain what you learn. Because we can all be good at reading books, but how much of that do we retain? So he does have a process and some tricks to actually teach us how we can retain what we learn. And we also talk about the skill of critical thinking and how to develop and evolve the critical skill of critical thinking. So a really, really interesting subject and a very interesting interview. And somewhat different to the norm, but really, really interesting. And you can get a lot more information about Scott and his book in the show notes. If you want to get some more interesting content, and we've got some great interviews with some great people, go to the website, www.johnmurphyinternational.com, and you will find loads of good stuff there. If you want to reach out, have a chat with me, you can get in touch with me through the website, or my email address is john@johnmurphyinternational.com. But in the meantime, sit back and enjoy this really, really interesting interview with Scott Young. Scott, you're very welcome here to the podcast. I'm delighted to have you. I know that it's early morning in Vancouver, a beautiful city, by the way. And but you're very welcome, and thank you for being a guest here.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show.
No, listen, I'm just fascinated. How did your fascination, because I'm sure it is really a fascination with learning, how did that come about? Where did it all begin for you?
Well, I've always been very interested in learning new things and sort of self-improvement more generally. So this has always been a topic that's been kind of dear to my heart. But I think the ideas, particularly those of the kind of unique style of learning that I try to put forth in this book, came from having a few formative experiences of meeting some people that were doing some really just incredible things. So I talk about in this book this kind of chance encounter I had with this fellow by the name of Benny Lewis, who at the time was just starting his blog where he had this personal mission to try to learn a language to fluency in 3 months. And he was hopping around the globe learning languages really quickly. And at the time, I was struggling with learning French. I had been in France for certainly more than 3 months, and I didn't feel like my French was progressing that much. So just the idea that someone would be even attempting to do something so much grander than I was, and, I felt like I was a smart guy. I was someone who was really working hard at it. What did this guy know that I didn't? And so that was sort of my, down the rabbit hole moment, if I can use the Alice in Wonderland metaphor, to this kind of world of people who are not only very, very interested in the learning process and have curiosity like many of us do, but really interested in how do you optimize it? How do you make it more effective? And this was really kind of the start of a 10-year process of myself taking on interesting little projects and challenges, but also getting into some of the research, getting my hands dirty with recognizing how a lot of the assumptions we have about how you learn things are not true, and how this leads us to make mistakes.
And going back to just your experience with Benny and what you actually took from that, I mean, what did he do that was different to the traditional learning? What did he do that actually, because I mean, to achieve that is no mean feat. And I say that as somebody who lives in France, by the way. So I empathize with you that, here am I still struggling, and I'm a number of years there.
It's challenging.
What did you do differently?
I think So there's a number of things, but I think one of the major ones, and this is one of the ones that I would point as, in my opinion, one of the major deficits of how we typically think about learning languages in school, is that we think about it as you show up to a class, maybe you have like an hour a day if you're doing it somewhat intensively, you're doing an hour a day of study of, you have a textbook, you have some tutor giving you through lessons, and you walk through little kind of mock conversations, but you're not actually using it to communicate with people. You're not actually using it in real situations. And what I think separated Benny is that from nearly the get-go, from having a very low level of ability, he was throwing himself into these immersive learning situations where his sort of philosophy is what he calls speak from day one, where he just starts speaking with people. And when you're actually using the language to learn, it sort of bootstraps you to a level of proficiency much faster than I would say the typical mastering conjugation patterns first, and you do this for months and months before you start learning. And certainly a lot better than I think the new wave of here's a little fun app game that you can play on your phone that is only very, very tentatively related to the actual act of having the language to communicate. And so I think that's one example of where, and we can go into it, there's this principle I talk in the book called directness, where there's actually this huge amount of psychological research that shows that when we learn things, we tend to learn them in fairly narrow and specific ways, at least when we start learning them. And so what that means is that if you start learning, let's say, a language and you're doing something on your phone, it may not transfer as much to real, genuine conversation situations as you might naively think. And so this has a lot of implications for how we learn not just languages, but all sorts of things. Where if you want to get really good at a skill, but you end up doing some practice that is actually something different, you end up having sort of this impoverished skill set where, you spend months and months in a classroom or months and months studying. And afterward, you're like, oh, wow, actually, I'm not as good at this as I thought I would be after all this time. And so the people I interviewed were often masters of like cutting at the heart of what's really difficult at some new skill, doing that practice very early, and, not sort of surprisingly getting much better at it than you would naively expect.
Okay. So, I mean, okay, I get when you're talking about kind of learning a language that you go to the country and you just kind of throw yourself in there and you learn. But if you're going, say, to do, something else, if you're going to learn about, I'm trying to give a good example. I mean, if I want to study engineering, right? I mean, how do you aggressively learn engineering?
Well, I think there's some similar principles. Obviously, every topic you learn is going to be a little different. But if we're talking about engineering, one of the big things I would say is that you have to work on actual problems. And if we're going to go, let's say, a little bit further than that, let's say we're talking about maybe computer science, where you have maybe the tools at home. I mean, no one's building a dam in their sort of living room. So there is a certain sense that you need to learn some formal study for that. But if you're learning, let's say, computer engineering, where you do have access to being able to write your own programs and stuff, a lot of the people who are quite successful at it go into writing their own programs quite early on, as opposed to just doing, purely kind of a theoretical study. This isn't to say that theoretical study doesn't matter, but that the sequencing is important. That it isn't to say that learning a grammar or vocabulary is unimportant for learning a language. Certainly Benny Lewis or myself wouldn't advocate for that. But rather, if you spend a lot of time doing that without actually doing any of the kind of real practice, the real thing you're doing, you often have these transfer hiccups later where you're trying to, oh wait, what was that thing that I learned in that class 6 months ago? And then only now am I finally finding some use for it. Yeah. Whereas if you're actually immersed in this real situation, you're solving real engineering problems, you're solving real problems that you'd be using these solutions for. Then when you have to learn these sort of abstract techniques, they fit into place, they just lock into it, what you're doing, and they make sense. And so I think that's one of the things that a lot of people struggle with when they're learning is this transition to application.
Yeah, it's what you're saying, therefore that, okay, there's fine about learning kind of the theory or something, but you actually need to be actively doing something with the learning that you're doing in order to embed the learning. Is that what you're saying?
That's definitely a big part of it. I think there's a common kind of understanding we have of learning and education that comes from this classroom model, where what you do is you sit, the way learning happens, according to most people, is you sit in a classroom and someone lectures at you, and then you learn the material. And then maybe, if you want, kind of this is the optional step, if you want, you could like do a test or something after to just check whether you learned anything. Right. And I would like to flip that, not to say that sitting in the classroom is totally unimportant. It is, but I'd like to shift the emphasis. So the emphasis should be more on the homework and the test being where you actually learn how to do the thing, rather than just being a final kind of cursory check on whether you learned it in the lecture. And I think this is something that we kind of imbibe as our model for how learning works because we spend so much time in school. But I think the school model, where you have one teacher for many students, and especially the university model, where maybe you have one lecturer for 300 students, and the kind of assumption is they're just going to go off and do whatever they have to do to learn it on their own, that this is a fairly recent innovation. This is not how we have learned throughout most of our history. Most of our history we learned through an apprenticeship model where there was one person to, one master to one student. They got you to actually work on some real work. And then they showed you, oh, don't do this, do it this way because you're doing this wrong. And that's how you learned real skills. And so I think the idea that this classroom model represents the pinnacle of how we ought to acquire information is flawed, to say the least. And it doesn't mean that you can't learn things from classrooms, but it does mean that if you go in and you approach it with the mindset of, I'm going to learn some things and I'm going to hear some things, but the way I'm really, really going to understand it is through applying it myself to real situations and working through practice problems. That, I think, is the attitude I like to express.
And if you take your book Ultralearning, you're saying it's a strategy for aggressive self-learning. I suppose two things. Why do we need to learn aggressively, and why self-learn?
So the aggressiveness is merely to point out a lot of the people that I had these kind of formative experiences with were kind of the pioneers in this way. So I don't want to say that you need to necessarily be trying to learn a language in 3 months or trying to do something extreme, but that if you understand the people who really take it to the ultimate level, you can figure out maybe some principles for yourself at a more modest level. So similarly, if you understand how elite athletes train for tennis, you can probably incorporate some of those principles for improving your tennis game, even if you don't want to play in Wimbledon. And so I think the same ideas apply here. And the reason I highlight aggressive is that there's a common pattern in a lot of these principles where something that is more effortful, it requires more conscious attention and deliberate effort, turns out to be more effective for learning than something that's naturally easier. So I think if you just take the idea that I want to be effective, it naturally pushes you to do some things that are going to be slightly more uncomfortable, slightly more strenuous, but much, much more effective. So we already talked about, actually using the language to communicate in the beginning. Obviously, this is not as easy as just playing on a game on your phone, but it turns out to be much, much more effective. And so if you can force yourself to kind of get over that initial hiccup of, all right, I actually have to do this, and you start speaking it, and you can commit to that, you can go much, much further than you would with another approach. And similarly, if you are learning something like mathematics or engineering and you want to really master it, and you get into the problem sets and you get into frustration and you get into, well, I don't know how to do this and I'm experiencing this, you end up learning a lot better than if you were to just read it and just kind of skim over this document of what this idea is. And so this idea of ultralearning is really, if you care about results, if you care about being good at the skill that you're learning, it's not just entertainment for you. This isn't just something to fill your Sunday afternoon. This is something that you care about being good at. Then you are naturally sort of inclined towards this somewhat more aggressive approach. How aggressive you do it is up to you, but I think you're naturally inclined in that direction.
And you're a big advocate of self-learning.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mean, when you say self-learning, are you kind of excluding the classroom, excluding the curricula? Is that what you mean by self-learning, or is it just
pedantic? To be a bit pedantic, what I like to talk about in the book is what I call self-directed learning, which it sounds like I'm splitting hairs, but what I really want to point out is there's a difference between where the learning takes place, let's say in a classroom versus at home, and that's the distinction I don't really care about. What I care about is who is driving the learning forward. Is it the learner, or is it sort of a teacher or an institution? And a lot of us have been learned to be kind of the passive subjects of our education, that we just show up to the class and we do what they tell us to do. Teacher says, do this homework, read this chapter. Okay, I'll do that. Oh, it didn't say don't read that chapter. Those are optional exercises. Well, I guess I'm not doing them. And the self-directed learner is someone who says, okay, well, who cares about whatever is going on in this class and what they've assigned? I have a goal to be good at this thing, or to know this thing, or to have this skill or ability that I don't have right now. And what's the best way to do that? And sometimes that's going to take you through a class. That's going to take you through, a formal book or formal instruction. That indeed often happens. It's often the case that the best way to learn a skill is to have someone teach it to you. I'm not trying to imply otherwise. But I think that this self-directed approach is so important right now, because we're living in a world where, quite frankly, if you look at what they teach in a lot of university education, it doesn't align with a lot of our personal goals. They're going to be teaching you things that maybe they care about for their particular niche research interests, but don't actually apply to what you care about to succeed in your business, in your career, or even in your hobbies or your life. And so we need to be taking this action to direct our own learning. Otherwise, we're just going to be the victim of whatever other interests other people have for us.
Yeah. So it's really taking responsibility for the learning, as opposed to being, as you say, being passive and saying, okay, read chapters A to Z or
Yeah.
B, or whatever it might be. In terms of if you look at it, to try and go back on what you're saying, if you were advising somebody to say, okay, I want to learn a language other than maybe go and stay and live in France or whatever like that, but I want to learn a language, I want to learn a new skill. Give somebody kind of a process as to what you think is the best way to actually learn that. I know that's a bit of a generalized question,
Right.
but in general, what is the process to go and learn?
So the first step I always start with is one of the principles I talk about in the book, which is called meta learning, which is where if you are going to drive your own sort of path forward to acquiring a skill, you have to understand what is the way that this skill is typically acquired. So look at how other people who've been successful at acquiring the skill, how did they do it? What approach do they take? And this doesn't tell you what the ideal approach is, but it gives you a starting point. It tells you what is, this is the approach that probably will work. Maybe it's not optimal in all ways, but it probably will work. And then you can start sort of tweaking it. So if I were to look at language learning as one of the examples you pointed out, I think you will find that of the people who actually speak, let's say, multiple languages, or they're good at learning languages, very few of them use Duolingo. But Duolingo is super popular, people who don't speak languages. So if you just go into what are good language learning apps and you don't actually ask, well, what did people who actually learned the language use? You're sort of drawn towards these resources that are like kind of fun, but maybe not that useful. And similarly, if you were to look at like programming, you could talk to programmers like what would be good resources to use or what would be a good approach to take. And this can give you it can help eliminate some of the bad options and give you sort of a rough guideline of where you should start. Then the way that I go further with that is just to use these first principles and your own kind of personal experience to see where you could maybe tweak things. So I already talked about directness. This is a pretty universal principle, meaning that if you know, for instance, that your goal is to get on stage and deliver a presentation about this, then a good practice technique for whatever you're learning would be to kind of deliver little mock presentations, even by yourself, just to see that you can understand and explain it. And the reason for that is that the little skills that you need in order to be able to explain it are going to be the same as when you're doing these mock explanations, whereas they might not be exactly the same if you're doing a totally different kind of practice. Let's say you're just reading something, or you're just, maybe just solving problems, but you're not actually having to explain why they are the way they are. So that's another principle. And there's a bunch of these principles like this that I think you can use them to sort of, from that starting point, kind of tweak the dial, so to speak. And often it makes a really big difference. Going from not getting feedback to getting good feedback in a situation can sometimes mean the difference between an exponential growth and someone who just stagnates for years. So it does make a big difference if you pay attention to these things.
In your book on Ultralearning, your promise is, and I quote you, is to transform how you work, live, and learn. That's a hell of a promise. How does that transform how I work, live? I get the learning bit, but how I work and how I live? Explain
well,
that.
I will say, first of all, that the jackets of the books are typically written by the editor. So you're not quoting me, but I will stand by what was written in the jacket. So I will defend it despite not being my wording. I think that learning is often underrated as being a very powerful tool for how you think about your life. That often when we think about our problems, we don't think about them as learning problems. We think about them as, well, I'm trying to start a business, or, well, I'm trying to have a better relationship, or, well, I'm trying to lose weight. And so the learning aspect of that is kind of in the background. And what I want to do is bring it to the foreground. Realize that if you want to start a business, the way that you are successful at that is by learning to be a good business owner, to be a good entrepreneur. The way you have good relationships is by understanding the other person that you're with, learning how they work, and learning how relationships work in general. That if you want to lose weight, you have to understand your body, you have to understand fitness, but you also have to understand motivation and habits and so many other things. And so I really see learning as being this linchpin for anything else that you want to do and achieve. It's going to come through some kind of effort where you are acquiring a skill that you don't have right now. And so I really think that if you can examine that learning process, what is the process of acquiring knowledge? What is the process of acquiring skills? You can often make these kind of breakthroughs where you realize, oh, that's the reason that I haven't been getting better at this, is because I'm not getting any feedback, or because I'm not doing direct practice, or even little subtle things like, I have a whole chapter on retrieval, which is that the main reason that you forget things is because you just look at them, you don't practice remembering them. And this has all sorts of implications for, how many business books do you read that you can barely remember the contents of them 2 years later? This is important. I mean, if you are going to read a library of business books that are supposed to help you become a better entrepreneur, it would be nice if you could remember some of the ideas in them.
So how do you retain it? Because that's actually a really good point. Because, I mean, I speak for myself, I shouldn't speak on behalf of other people. I read a lot of books, but I also forget an awful lot that I've read. So how do you retain what you've read?
So the first thing I would say is that forgetting is ubiquitous. Forgetting is the default. So we have to keep that in mind whenever we're thinking about anything that we want to learn, is that by default, everything that you learn is sort of on this slowly decaying function where you slowly forget all the things that you've learned. And I think there's two factors here when we're talking about, let's say, the business book that you read. The first is just you did know it at one point and it slowly fades because of just this time delay. And the main antidote to that is what is known as spacing. So there's this huge psychological literature on the spacing effect, which shows that if you expose yourself to information, same amount of time, but spread out over different time periods, you will remember it far longer than if that same amount of time is bunched up over a short period of time. Similarly, if we're talking about learning something, sometimes the problem is not just how do you, something you previously learned and now you've forgotten it, but you never actually really learned it properly the first time. You never actually really encoded it into your brain. And so one of my great examples of that, of the way to remedy that, is by practicing retrieval. Retrieval is this idea that you just close the book you're reading and you just try to remember what was in it. What did you just read? And the funny thing is that if you do this exercise, even if you just finished reading it, you often forget quite a bit. There's often a lot of, oh, wait, what was that? Or you remember 3 points and there was actually 8 points or something like this. And so I think this is a really good litmus test, not only because it gives you some feedback, it lets you know, okay, what stuff did I actually remember from that? Oh, actually, for these 5 pages, I was kind of daydreaming. So I wasn't really paying attention to what the author was saying. And now I don't know what's going on. But also because if you get this, you actually do this process of practicing trying to remember, you make your memory stronger. So by doing this, you make it so that you can remember longer. There's lots of really interesting studies showing how if you force students to use this technique, even though they maybe wouldn't want to do it, they will remember more than if they, just reread the passage that they've been assigned. And so this is something that's quite powerful. And a real easy way of doing it is just, you're reading a book and every time you get to a chapter, you can just close it and just try to mentally, okay, what did I cover in that chapter? Or you pick up a book that you hadn't been reading for a while and just, okay, before I pick up the book, what did I read? What was in the book, so far? And just by reiterating this, you strengthen those memories, you make them more long-term. And this is one way that you can recall more of what you're reading and really make it more useful to you.
It's like exercising any muscle, isn't it? I mean, it's pretty similar in that sense. I mean, one of the things that I try and do is highlight as I'm reading a book, whether it's a hard book or a digital book, is to highlight it. And then once I finish it is to actually just go back over what I've highlighted. Yeah. But I mean, you're taking it a step further. So that's actually kind of embedding that a little bit more. You're talking there about in terms of learning. And one of the things that I know that you've written about is, the skill at critical thinking. And I know that you've written about that. And, critical thinking is a really important and perhaps not often talked about skill in many ways. I think it's underrated. But how do you improve your critical thinking skills? What are the things that you need to do? Just because it's something that we all need to do. It's a skill that I think that pretty much everybody needs to have. But I don't think it's one that's how to develop.
So my thoughts on critical thinking are a little bit different because the way that it's typically thought is that critical thinking, like if you take critical thinking classes in college, let's say, I'll use that as my kind of straw man argument here. If you look at those, this is what they'll do. You'll sit down and they'll teach you a few like syllogisms. Like this is, this is how like A, and then if A, then B, then B.
Yeah.
They'll teach you these forms and then be like, look, now you understand critical thinking. And maybe you get a little bit more sophisticated. They'll teach you a few fallacies, maybe a little bit of statistical reasoning. They'll give you a few of what I'll call these kind of like really abstract idealizations of how reasoning ought to work. And then that is supposed to be how you are supposed to reason about real things in real life. And the thing that I think is clear here is that this is not how people actually reason about things. They don't use syllogisms. They're not using these kind of logical forms. And we have countless studies showing all these biases where they fail to apply these forms. So clearly that wasn't how they were reasoning about them. But also the way that we actually are acquiring critical thinking and skills is by having exposure to a lot of examples, a lot of patterns. So people who are able to think critically about business decisions, for instance, have this wealth of experience of seeing lots of examples of this happening and then this happening. And so they can sort of see from the patterns that are involved what's going on here. And so I think the idea that I would sort of push back against is the idea that critical thinking is a skill separate from having content knowledge, separate from sort of knowing things about the domain that you're working with. And so there's a really fascinating book that I recommend if you're interested in critical thinking and reason in general, called The Enigma of Reason by Hugo Mercier and Dan Spurbe. And that book basically makes the argument that the way that our sort of reason works psychologically is not by, again, this sort of syllogistic reasoning where we get sort of logical forms. These are the premises and therefore these conclusions. But rather, we have these sort of intuitive modules for making observations about the world. And these intuitive modules are probably based on large amounts of actual experience. So it's sort of like a pattern recognition. You recognize, oh, no, I know that this kind of problem, this has this kind of answer, or I've seen this before, it's kind of like this. And it's more sophisticated than just like looking up some pattern in the past. You're actually kind of working with it and reasoning with it. But that what we're actually doing when we're reasoning is mostly coming up with what's a good argument for justifying this sort of intuitive answer that I got. That when we think about our actual faculties of reason, what I'm doing right now, or what I'm doing when I'm trying to justify what I'm saying, is not that I logically deduce the right answer, but that something in me recognized what the right answer was, and now I have to come up with some words to justify why that was the right answer. And so I think once you recognize that, it also makes sense as to why our reason typically fails. And so one of the suggestions they had for improving your reasoning is actually, because it is a sort of a social function, is actually having conversations and debates and discussions with other people. Because if someone can say, oh, no, but here's the problem, this isn't working because of this, or you have to, I don't like that reason you gave, you have to justify yourself. Then you have to go back and reflect on these sort of intuitively arrived at answers you have and be like, why is that not right? And trying to work something out. So really interesting experiments where they have people fail these logical puzzles individually. So it'll be one of these puzzles where you have like cards and there's certain rules and you have to check which cards flip to make it right. And people are really bad at this. They pick the wrong cards. But if you get a group of people and ask them to discuss what they think the right answer is, they almost always settle on the right answer as a group, even if individually they mostly fail. Because if only one person figures out what the right answer is, they can explain why it's the right answer. Everyone gets the right answer. And so I think this kind of ability to discuss our ideas and debate them and share them, and even really just articulating your ideas in a written form, is a good way to improve your critical thinking, just because it allows you to have that introspection and to kind of pull that back on yourself and look at some of your own ideas.
That's really interesting. When you're writing, and I I appreciate that what I quoted you was actually the marketing people selling the book.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you for the book Ultralearning, what is your wish that people actually get from reading that book? What do you want them to walk away with? What do you want them to do or think? What is that you want to change?
Well, what I would hope, and this is something I kind of hinted at the beginning, is that I kind of got down this path, and one that really transformed my entire life, because I had some exposures to some people who were doing these things in unorthodox ways. And I want for other people to be exposed to those examples. And I think that there's going to be a lot of people that'll read the book and be like, that was interesting, and close it, and maybe they won't think about it again. But for every few people that read the book, maybe they'll read it and be like, wow, that's something that I'd like to do. I'd like to do something like that. I'd always wanted to learn Spanish. Maybe I could do it a different way and really be able to speak Spanish. Or I've always wanted to learn computer programming. Or I've always wanted to learn statistics or finance or whatever skill that you find interesting. And I want people to see that this is possible, that this is something that you can do, and hopefully to have a little bit of a roadmap and how you might possibly approach it. And I am so grateful for having had that exposure 10 years ago myself, that I want to try to pay it forward to people who might similarly not have had that exposure and think that the only way to learn things was to go through an expensive 4-year degree or spend years and years struggling and grinding without much result.
Yeah, I think that there's kind of a compelling evidence to demonstrate that the traditional way of teaching is not exactly working. So I think that, to come up with a kind of a fresh way of doing it and a fresh way of thinking about it and a fresh way of approaching it is fantastic. And I just think it's a fascinating subject, and it's one that we all need to embrace for all different reasons, but we all need to embrace it. Before we wrap up and to say where people can get in touch with you, 2 questions that I ask everybody.
Sure.
A book other than your own, that has had an impact upon you. You mentioned one, maybe that's the one, or maybe there's another one.
Well, now that I'm thinking about it, I really do like The Enigma of Reason because no one's read it, and I really like that book. If I were to think of a book that is a little bit more, a little bit more mainstream, a little bit less abstract, I really like the book Deep Work by Cal Newport, a friend of mine, and I would say that it's also another one of my favorites for thinking about how to be productive and successful in sort of the modern knowledge economy.
Sorry, I didn't catch the name. Who's it written by?
Deep Work by Cal Newport.
All right. Okay. That's not one that I've come across before. That's one. That's one for the list. That's one for the list.
One for the list. Yeah.
Yeah. Daily rituals. Do you have any? And what are they? And what do they do for you?
So my daily rituals change a lot depending on the kind of projects I have. But I would say one that I frequently come back to is when I'm working on a hard project is to just get up and start working sort of first thing straight in the morning. I find that the more if you can get done like 4 or 5 hours of solid work in the morning, then it almost kind of doesn't matter what you do with the rest of the day. I think this illusion that, the 9 to 5 and you're going to be working continuously 9 to 5 really doesn't apply to people who are doing knowledge work. And that if you can really focus on getting those morning hours of just, you were hyper concentrated and you just worked straight in that period, then, you can probably even take the afternoon off and you'd still be more productive. So doing that, starting work right in the morning has been something that, in many of my learning projects, that's been how I started the day. When I was writing my book, that was how I started and got over the writer's block and procrastination that all authors inevitably face. And so this was something that I think I would recommend highly to anyone who's thinking about it.
And now you're getting up early because you've got a young baby.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
that might change that a little bit.
Yeah, it might be a little bit. It might be a little bit different.
Might interfere with that somewhat. Before we wrap up, Scott, this has been fascinating. It really has been. Where can people get in touch with you? We'll have it all in the show notes, but just people are listening now, how can they get in touch with you?
Perfect. Well, I highly recommend anyone who wants to check out the book. It's called Ultralearning. It's available Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you get your books as well. It's also available on Audible. So if you're not tired of listening to me, you can listen to me narrate the book. And you can also go to my website at www.scotthyoung.com. And there I have over 1,000 articles on topics from learning, habits, goal setting, and really just thoughts about life and some of these topics that we have touched upon in this discussion today.
Yeah, well, I can tell listeners that there is an amazing treasure trove of content on your website. You certainly do give away an awful lot of really good stuff. And Scott, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure and real honor, and I wish you every success.
No, thank you so much for having me.